Directional terms are important to learn because you compare one body part to another using these directional terms. There's a worksheet in Moodle as well as an answer key to that worksheet. I suggest you do that. These directional terms come in pairs. So anterior pairs with posterior. Anterior is to the front of, posterior is behind. There's another set that means the same thing, another pair, ventral versus dorsal. So think of the dorsal fin of a shark. Another pair is superficial and deep. Superficial is near the surface. Deep is inside the body. So you could say the heart is deep to the skin. The ribs are superficial to the lungs. Superior and inferior. Superior is above, inferior is below. But if we're talking specifically on the limbs, we use proximal and distal, comparing how near or how far that body part is to the trunk. So you might say the wrist is distal to the elbow. The fingers are distal to the wrist. The elbow is proximal to the hand. We can compare toward the side versus toward the middle. That would be lateral versus medial. In anatomical position, the thumb is lateral to the pinky. Cranial or cephalic compared to caudal. Caudal is toward the tail. Cranial or cephalic toward the head. Which of the following terms is most appropriately used for structures in a limb? That would be distal. Here we're looking at sections. So oftentimes a picture will show you a section of the body. You have to be able to understand where that section comes from. So look at the purple plane. This purple plane divides the human from front to back. You could say the purple plane separates the anterior from the dorsal, the anterior from the posterior part of the body, or the ventral from the dorsal. This plane, this purple plane, is called a frontal plane or coronal plane. Oops, what happened here? Okay. The transverse plane is this plane here, which separates top from bottom. This transverse plane could be through the neck, which would separate the head from this plane that separates the left side from the right side is called mid-sagittal. The sagittal plane, but directly down the center. I don't know that. Directly down the center would be mid-sagittal. Which of the following sections will show both lungs and the heart and the liver? So let's go back here. Which section will show both the heart, the lungs, and the liver? That would be a frontal plane. Body cavities are a little tricky. You're introduced to them in this chapter. You really should learn them in this chapter because they're going to come up again later, kind of over and over again throughout anatomy and physiology. So anyway, our body cavities are parts of the body that have these subdivisions. And these regions that are divided are lined by a membrane called serous membrane. Serous membranes make serous fluid. And serous fluid prevents friction. The membranes will protect delicate organs from shocks and impacts, and also the membranes allow for changes in size and shape of these internal organs. Another word for organ is viscera. So this diagram here shows the serous membrane of surrounding the heart. The area surrounding the heart is called the pericardium, and this membrane is the pericardial membrane. The cavity is the pericardial cavity. It produces serous fluid to prevent friction. Without that serous fluid, you would probably feel every heartbeat. So serous membranes are double membranes, and we'll see that in a second. Actually, you can kind of see that here. This, as you punch your fist into a partially filled up balloon, you can see the double membrane system. And actually, you can see here that one membrane is right on the viscera, or right on the organ. And this outer membrane will line the cavity. So again, the heart has the pericardium, or pericardial membrane. So here is the pericardial cavity. The chest area is the thoracic region, so here is the thoracic cavity. This area below or inferior to the diaphragm is the abdominal pelvic cavity. It's subdivided by into the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity, and what separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity is the diaphragm. The thoracic cavity has a membrane system called the pleura. There are two pleural cavities, one for each lung, and the pleura contain the lungs. The mediastinum is the region between the lungs that contains connective tissue and the pericardial cavity. So here is the mediastinum. This would be the thoracic cavity, and the pleura are the membranes that cover the lungs. The abdominal pelvic cavity, everything deep to the abdominal and pelvic walls, divided into two portions, the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The pelvic cavity contains more than you would think. It contains the urinary bladder. If you were to look at the torso, that is very, very deep inside the pelvis. It contains the reproductive organs and the last portion of the digestive tract called the rectum. The abdominal pelvic cavity has the peritoneal membrane, or the peritoneum. Some organs are outside that. For example, the kidneys are dorsal to the peritoneal membrane, or posterior to the peritoneum, so they are called retroperitoneal. Some organs extend inferior to the peritoneal cavity. They would be infraperitoneal. That's not as common. Retroperitoneal is very common. So here's our peritoneal cavity, and retroperitoneal would be behind that membrane. What membrane covers the stomach? Okay, you're in the abdominal pelvic cavity, so it must be the peritoneum.